Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Megan Wong. I'm a lecturer here at the University of Essex, where I'm also the postgraduate director for the LLM in International Law. I'm delighted to be your host for today's session of the Essex Public International Law Lecture Series with today's lecture by Professor Hilary Charlesworth entitled The Travels of Human Rights, the UNESCO Human Rights Exhibition 1950 to 1953, chaired by Dr. Emily Jones. Before I introduce our chair, Dr. Emily Jones, and our esteemed speaker, Professor Hilary Charlesworth, let me first introduce the Essex Public International Law Lecture Series. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome to our series. And for those of you who are joining us again, it's great to have you back. The Essex Public International Law Lecture Series is very much founded on friendship between Dr. Jones and I, and our mutual respect for each other's scholarship and approaches to international law. Although Dr. Jones and I are both generalist public international lawyers, our approaches differ as I'm a formalist and she's a critical legal scholar. Yet we take pride each in our individual approaches to international law and also celebrate our different approaches by putting together this series, which combines both formalism and international legal practice and international legal theory. Our lecture series was inaugurated by Professor Niels Blocher from the University of Leiden on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the first Security Council resolution in January this year, followed by a series of excellent lectures by Professor Larry Malkso from the University of Tartu, Dr. Dina Suvala from Australian National University, Colombian career diplomat and head of treaty section Lucia Solano from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Colombia, Professor Marty Koskaniemi from the University of Helsinki, and His Excellency Judge Kriangsa Kitichaisari from the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. This will be our penultimate lecture for this spring term, but we'll be back in the summer term, and I hope you will join us then again. Our final speaker for this term's program will be Professor Campbell McLaughlin, QC from Victoria University of Wellington. And now let me introduce our chair for today's lecture, who will then introduce our speaker, Professor Hilary Charlesworth. I am proud and pleased to introduce Dr. Emily Jones, who is my formidable friend, colleague, co-founder, and co-convener. Dr. Emily Jones is a lecturer in law at the University of Essex. She's a generalist public international lawyer specializing in gender and international law, science and technology and international law, and international environmental law. Dr. Jones has recently published a co-authored book with Zed entitled The Law of War and Peace, A Gender Analysis, Volume 1, and I understand the launch is coming soon, so something to attend and to look out for. And something else to look out for is Dr. Jones' monograph, Feminist Theory in International Law, Posthuman Perspectives, which is forthcoming with Routledge's Glasshouse series. So a lot of scholarship to look forward to from Dr. Jones. And now I leave the floor to our chair and distinguished speaker.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wong. It's my absolute pleasure to be here with you all today, this evening, this morning, wherever you're tuning in from. Professor Charlesworth is someone that I have very much looked up to for a long time and admired, and who's inspired my work greatly over the years. So it's really an absolute pleasure to have her with us here today, and to welcome her to the Essex Public International Law Lecture Series. So Professor Hilary Charlesworth is a Melbourne Laureate Professor at Melbourne Law School, as well as a distinguished professor at the Australian National University. She is a member of the Institut de Droit International and served as a judge ad hoc in the International Court of Justice in the whaling in the Antarctic case between Australia and Japan. And she is currently judge ad hoc in the Arbitral Award of the 3rd of October 1899 case between Guyana and Venezuela. So the title of Professor Charlesworth's lecture today is The Travels of Human Rights, the UNESCO Human Rights Exhibition 1950 to 53. So really interesting topic and lots of different kind of themes that I'm sure many of you are tuning in to listen to. Just a kind of very quick housekeeping note before I pass on to our speaker today. You can ask questions at any time using the Q&A function that's in the bottom of your screen. We will ask questions at the end. If you do not want me to read your name out, then please send your question in anonymously. So there's just like a little tab that you click with the arrow down and you click send anonymous. So that's kind of it with the housekeeping rules. And without further ado, I would like to hand over to our fantastic speaker today, Professor Hilary Charlesworth. Over to you.
Many thanks, Emily and Megan, for inviting me to this lecture series. I'm delighted to be here. I want to acknowledge, first of all, that I am speaking to you from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here in Australia, whose land was never ceded to the British settlers. Well, the paper I'm going to give tonight comes out of a chapter that I wrote in a collection edited by my Melbourne Law School colleagues, Sandhya Bahuja and Shane Chalmers, which is the Routledge Handbook on International Law and the Humanities, which will be coming out in mid-year, and I recommend that you look out for it. It's got a wonderful series of chapters on international law and the humanities. But from my own research perspective, this is part of a larger project on art and international law. So the idea is, well, international law generally, the way we approach it, it's really fixated on the written word. If you think of the main activities that international lawyers undertake, all the classic activities, reading treaties, reading judicial decisions and resolutions, as well as the writings of all those eminent publicists, that's our very medium. And of course, international lawyers in turn produce more words, memoranda, judgments, blog posts, papers, articles, and books. So central to being an international lawyer, it might seem, is access and production of the written word. Indeed, as Jessie Homan has said, and this is a quote from her, the production of text can come to feel like the very purpose of international law. So the argument, I guess the larger argument of my project is that the dominance of the written word in international law has obscured the significance of the visual in the discipline. So international law, if we think about it, relies for much of its authority and meaning on symbols, iconography, representation, design, and architecture. So there is a really rich body of scholarship on the visuality of law generally, but there's been much less attention devoted to the image in the field of international law. So there are some fine exceptions to that, but by and large, the literature is relatively small. So borrowing from scholars of the law and visual generally, we might ask, how does the visual shape and transform international law? And what can we see if we pay attention to the visual? Well, there certainly have been scholars, particularly international relations scholars, who've analysed the close relationship between visual culture and the international human rights system. For example, they've observed the way that images have been relied on to evoke sympathy with the situation of others and to found the compassion that animated humanitarianism. So the idea from many of these scholars is that the visual has operated as a fast-track means of prompting emotions that influence political action in order to protect human rights. So building on all these literatures, borrowing from them, what the paper is an attempt to take the visual seriously in the field of international human rights law, which has such a fixation otherwise on the written word. So the focus is a travelling exhibition which was designed by UNESCO in 1950 to introduce the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which of course was adopted, as every student of international law knows, by the UN General Assembly on the 10th of December 1948. Now, the assertion that this was the Universal Declaration was controversial at the time. We can think, for example, of the famous objections of the American Anthropological Association to the assertion of universality. But despite these critiques, and obviously some critiques came from countries from the South and Southern jurists, but the idea of universality has remained a central feature of the international human rights system right to today. Well, to look first at all, what was the UNESCO exhibition? And at this point, I will try my tech skills to share my screen with you so you can see some images, and I'm hoping Emily will tell me if you can't see that, but I'm hoping what you can see is an image of the first Director General of UNESCO, the British scholar Julian Huxley. Well, from its founding in 1945, UNESCO fostered a variety of cosmopolitanism based on world citizenship. So this was presented by Huxley and others as the ineluctable route to progress from local and national communities. So universal human rights were obviously an important aspect of the Cosmopolitan project, and UNESCO seized on the Universal Declaration as a vehicle to achieve the one world that was the catchphrase of Julian Huxley. So, of course, as many of you will know, the actual drafting of the Universal Declaration was done through the Commission on Human Rights by a subcommittee of the UN Commission on Human Rights. But UNESCO in Paris had kept a very close eye on the drafting process. Indeed, it had really irritated the committee established by the UN Commission on Human Rights, the one that was chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt. They feared that UNESCO was trying to take over debates to claim ownership of the area of human rights. In 1947, so during the drafting period of the Universal Declaration, UNESCO hastily organised a survey which was sent out rather scattergun to governments, individuals and institutions such as trade unions and universities, seeking contributions on the conceptual basis of a declaration on human rights for the modern world. And eventually about 60 replies were received from this questionnaire, mainly from European intellectuals, including Julian Huxley's brother, Aldous Huxley, and Jacques Maritain. UNESCO then appointed a committee, which was chaired by the British historian E.H. Carr, to prepare a report on the survey responses that would be sent to the drafters of the Universal Declaration, who are sitting over in New York State. The report, the UNESCO report, concluded that human rights rested on universal principles, even if they're expressed in terms of different philosophic traditions. So they very much pushed the universality line. Well, the drafting committee of the Commission on Human Rights didn't pay much attention at all to UNESCO's contribution. But undeterred, after the adoption of the Universal Declaration by the General Assembly, UNESCO decided to launch a media program to promote the document. Now, one aspect of this media campaign was the deployment of what was thought to be then the universal language of photography. And the idea was this would introduce the unfamiliar language of the Declaration around the world. UNESCO regarded photography as an immediately accessible international language with no need of translation. And so this was going to be for UNESCO a really significant tool in establishing the international public sphere that underpinned the Huxleyan idea of one world. So UNESCO then, in 1949, just after the adoption of the Universal Declaration, UNESCO organised an exhibition on human rights at the Musée Galeria in Paris. And this, I think, quite delightful image comes from just after the launch of that exhibition. The exhibition itself was built inside the Galeria along a winding path over these pillars, which are about 3 meters high, and installations that displayed, and you can see some of them there, photographs, images, documents, and objects in a type of collage or montage. So UNESCO said, and I'm quoting from one of their publicity materials, that the illustrations mark the stages along the road leading from the caveman to the freed citizen of a modern democracy. Well, after the inaugural show in Paris that you see here, the exhibition was converted then into a portable exhibition, reproduced in 12,000 copies and sent to the United Nations 50 member states. And it was on show around the world until 1953. And this portable exhibition contained almost 300 monochrome images on 110 sheets, and each measuring about 48 centimetres by 31. So that's like 2 very large A3 sheets fitted together. And this kit that was sent out, and I'll show you an image of one in a minute, included brochure, which was called A Short History of Human Rights. So the exhibition, obviously 1950 to 53, was shown at a time when Europe was coming to terms with the devastation of the Second World War. And it was at the time that the Cold War was gearing up and anti-colonial movements were becoming more powerful. So in this era of political tension and indeed apparent fragmentation, UNESCO offered the history of human rights as a universal glue, and also the sense that Europe should re-articulate universal values. So the organising committee at UNESCO understood that the exhibition couldn't just show Western images, and it would have to get some images from outside the West. So it invited all UN member states to submit cultural and visual items that related to specific human rights, so that there could be contributions from all over the world. But in the end, as you'll see, the universalism of the exhibition had a distinctly European aura. And despite this request to all member states, the Human Rights Exhibition album was actually created by UNESCO's in-house designers. And they ended up sourcing much of the exhibition materials from newspapers, museums, and photo agencies. I assume because these images fitted the UNESCO narrative more readily. I haven't been able to track down some of the images that were submitted from countries. Now, I should say that there was some very strong reactions to the UNESCO endeavour. The new Islamic Republic of Pakistan complained, for example, that the exhibition failed to include images depicting Muslim contributions to human rights. And the response that UNESCO made was to produce a list of such images, but they were simply images from India and Pakistan and examples, and we'll see one very shortly, of Islamic calligraphy. The French Catholic Church, in its turn, complained that the album was overly secular and it called for its withdrawal. Well, I'd read about this travelling exhibition and seen reproduction of some of its images, and I found out that in Australia, about 20 of these kits had been received, but the exhibition actually was only held in 2 cities, in Brisbane and in Adelaide. But I did find one of these kits, and you can tell perhaps by the blurriness that I took this photo. One of these kits had actually ended up in the library of my university, at the University of Melbourne, and I've spent many very interesting days poring over this particular album that had very little attention in our library. Well, the exhibition constructed a universal history of human rights using a European lens and tended to flatten differences between cultures and peoples. So the idea, and this is exhibited both in the images and also in the booklet that accompanied the exhibition, the development of human rights was seen as the culmination of all that had gone before, and its foundations were in the shared history of humanity. Now, some images of the non-European world were included in the exhibition, and this is one of them, but they tended to be presented as elements in a type of universal melting pot. So this is sheet 8, and again, I have to admit to the low quality of that image, it's mine, my inferior phone, which is composed, you can see it's composed of 9 samples of different alphabets, including cuneiform, Devanagari, Arabic, and Latin. And the label that UNESCO provided for these images is simply that all races, all civilizations, all nations have made their individual and valuable contributions to what is today the sum of human rights. And that was how that was represented. Well, the exhibition retained the organization of the Musée Galleria show, starting with a general introduction to human rights. And here's the very first image in the exhibition. So you can possibly tell there, this is the Earth. And in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a naked man and woman possibly the biblical Adam and Eve, hovering sort of far out in space. Now, the image of the globe in the travelling exhibition without markers of national territory, accompanied by the human figures, there was no caption, and this was unusual in the exhibition to explain it, but I assume it was designed to evoke somehow a universally attuned outlook. But obviously the classical style of the two figures, which conform with very European notions of universality, it shows straight away the limitations of the universality that was at stake. So that was the opening of the exhibition. And the rest of the exhibition was sort of a visual echo of the structure of the preamble of the Universal Declaration. So the next section in the exhibition after this one was entitled The Frailty of Human Rights. And the images there took images of Hitler's atrocities and Nazism, which were represented as the quintessential human rights abuses. There were, for example, no other human rights abuses shown. There were no references to colonialism. So a section on the frailty of human rights, and that was followed in the exhibition catalogue by a section which was by far the largest, the Conquest of Human Rights. And this depicted the development of the 30 articles of the Universal Declaration in 14 different clusters. And I'm just going to show you a couple of examples of those. Each set of images tracking the clusters of rights follows a rough pattern. First of all, there are representations of the absence of the right or rights in questions in so-called primitive communities. Then there are portraits of pioneers who campaigned for the right, followed by images showing the recognition of the right, and finally the spread and acceptance of the right. So that sort of movement from absence to pioneers to the right and its spread is present in all of the 14 clusters. And the images, again, as you'll see, are a mixture of photographs and reproduction of artworks. So when we're talking about the era where there were no rights, they're generally images of sculptures, engravings, and paintings. But the era of rights recognition is usually depicted in photographs, emphasizing their modernity, that we've only just reached this stage. So the message of universal application of the rights was reinforced by this paired back graphic art. And the first sheet for each cluster of rights, each of the 14 cluster of rights, featured a small line drawing, apparently depicting the essence of the right in question. And you can see these involve black and white abstract figures, almost always male, surrounded by symbols of the relevant human rights cluster. And here are some of the examples of representations of the abolition of slavery, the abolition of inhuman treatment, the right to an adequate standard of living and social security, and in the bottom right-hand corner, freedom of thought and opinion. It's interesting that these UNESCO imagery, the images sometimes change the emphasis of a right. And we can see this in the depiction, for example, of freedom of movement, which is set out in Article 13 of the Universal Declaration. While the right is expressed in individual terms, UNESCO translated it as essentially an adjunct to international trade through the opening up of spaces that were once considered, these are UNESCO's words, impenetrable. So the sequence begins with a 13th century picture of an Arab boat on the Euphrates and a 16th century engraving of European traders in Brazil. And if we look at the stylized graphic on the sheet, the first sheet, it shows two men, you can see here, one black and one white, both of them clutching briefcases while crossing a dotted line, presumably an international boundary. So you can see there's a plane in the image, suggesting that this travel has occurred through plane travel. Well, so we've got the first image where there was no freedom of travel, and the next plate celebrates what UNESCO calls the incalculable value of pilgrimages, missions and trade, with images of Marco Polo's caravan and a 16th century Persian painting of a pilgrimage to Mecca. And then the next images are a collage of depictions of different forms of travels from ancient times. There's a horse and a camel to modern times, the Queen Elizabeth and a male carrying plane. But the final image, I think, is quite a striking one. This is the final image in right to freedom of travel. And so this is showing the right to freedom of travel attained. And you can see what's striking about it is there's no human forms at all in this image. It's the bow of a docked, sleek cargo boat or ocean liner. The caption, UNESCO's caption, makes clear that the freedom is for the benefit of interstate trade rather than that for individuals. Another example of UNESCO's narrative is the cluster of rights described as social security, family and property, depicting Articles 16, 17, 22 and 23 of the Universal Declaration. So this first plate, and again, I apologise for the blurry state, it establishes the relevant human rights problem. This is the absence of rights as tyranny in the home. And you can see there are two images here. One is on the left-hand side is an undated but probably contemporary photo of, we are told by UNESCO, this is the quote, a Kabua warrior purchasing a chief's daughter for 4 goats. The other is a 17th century European engraving called The Wife Beater, showing a drunken man beating a woman. And UNESCO's caption here states, in former times, the father's authority was absolute and sometimes included the power of life and death over his children. Daughters were seldom allowed to choose their own husbands. So what's striking here, despite, and I apologise for my blurry images, displaying a 20th century photo of Africa juxtaposed with a 17th century European image to illustrate tyranny in the home, the human rights, the absence of human rights, suggests that the problem has been transcended already in the West. It belongs to former times. We had to go back to the 17th century to get an image of it, but that it persists today in Africa. Now, if you look at the edge of the sheet, you can see the UNESCO's image, and here's a larger version of it. You can see this is UNESCO's graphic summary of the right. So this reinforces the advanced nature of European society by depicting the essence of the right to family security with 3 white silhouettes of a classic nuclear family, a man, a woman wearing a dress, and a male child close together under a pitched tiled roof. So that I've shown you the first plate in the series and the graphic, and here's the second one where the right is realised. So this sequence is labelled, that 4 photos here are labelled domestic happiness. And you can see here 4 photographs of families. One is of a worker's family with 3 children having dinner, showing a European man, woman and children eating around a table. The one in the bottom left-hand corner, at least the way I see it, is the title given by UNESCO is Maori Mother with Her Child. And the one in the top right-hand corner is Mother and Children, Sierra Leone. The caption for this plate firmly anchors the family in a nuclear heterosexual context, and it says that a man and wife should find their chief happiness in the family life they build up together. What's interesting is in the non-European images from New Zealand and Sierra Leone, there are no fathers evident. But the really interesting one to me, the final photo of domestic happiness is, I hope you can see that, is a formal portrait of a youthful Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt with 5 of their children taken in 1919. Although it's not identified as such, but it's very obviously that family, and I found in a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt that it was taken in 1919. And of course, accounts of the deep estrangements within the Roosevelt family give an unintended ironic edge to this image. Well, UNESCO clearly didn't intend the irony of using that particular family image. But overall, I guess my point is the exhibition manufactured an idea of universality in its images and text by presenting human experiences similar across time and space. So all men and women are part of a family. All communities have the right to protest and so on. But the images were always stripped of their history and context. the idea is that these are now universal claims thanks to the Universal Declaration. It's also interesting looking at the UNESCO exhibition captions that dates are mainly given for images of Western life, while those of the non-Western world tend to be undated. And this creates a sense throughout the exhibition of inescapable progression in the West, while the rest of the world is lagging and needs to be brought up to speed. In this respect, the UNESCO exhibition differs from Edward Steichen's famous 1955 photographic exhibition, The Family of Man, that was put on display in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It's often compared, the UNESCO exhibition, although it was earlier, is often compared to the Edward Steichen's Family of Man. But it's interesting in that exhibition, Steichen's exhibition, that he didn't use captions and restricted the information available to the viewer to the name of the photographer, the location of the image, and the date it was taken. The spectator in that case was left deliberately by Steichen to interpret a photo in the light of multiple neighbouring images, producing, and here I quote from Ariella Azoulay, creating a partial repertoire of states of existence, situations and abuses in which humans find themselves. So Azoulay argues that, and again, these are her words, the fragility of the human condition is enfolded in each and every photograph in Steichen's exhibition. The images thus blur notions of victims and perpetrators. So Azoulay has certainly made the argument that the Steichen's Family of Man exhibition is indeed a much more effective declaration of human rights than the Universal Declaration of Human Rights itself. Well, to conclude then, Peter Fitzpatrick has observed that, and this is a quote from him, an obsession with origins is perhaps the most obvious substitute for the mythically transcendent. An obsession with origins is perhaps the most obvious substitute for the mythically transcendent. If we can't rely on the divine, then we need a clear account of our origins. We can observe this process of constructing an origin story in the UNESCO exhibition to reflect a myth of modernity, that history unfolds in a linear progression. The present is accepted as inevitable, and the past becomes simply a series of steps leading towards it. Well, more generally, the relationship between art and human rights has been widely studied, but typically it's been studied in a very instrumental way. How can each field bolster the other? And I was struck by the report of a major study by the European Union's Agency for Fundamental Rights, a 2017 study that looked at art and human rights. And it finally ended up with the recommendation that the fields of art and human rights should really join forces to gain strength from each other. And it presented, the whole report presented fields of art, broadly conceived, and human rights as in a symbiotic relationship. They could each help the other. And the report went on to call on artists to reinforce what it called the human rights message. It argued that, this is a quote from the EU report, perceptions are more powerful than facts, and art is all about perceptions. Art, the report said, can thus transcend barriers such as politics and language. So human rights lawyers should be really into art because this is a way of really getting across the importance of human rights. But I want to suggest that a more complicated relationship between art and human rights, a non-instrumental relationship, emerges if we take the visual seriously. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, of course, itself can be read as a response to the visual. Sharon Slewinski has argued that the widely published photographs from Dachau and Buchenwald, taken just after these concentration camps were abandoned by the Nazis, in fact, was those photographs, the visual, that prompted the drafting process. Against this visual evidence of inhumanity, the UNESCO exhibition marshalled images of human rights to tell a powerful story of the universal nature of human rights and of the inexorable progress of the human spirit. But paying attention to these images reveals that the particular has taken on the guise of the universal, and that the imagined universality presented in this exhibition rests on exclusions. There's absolutely no trace in the whole of the exhibition, for example, of the effects of colonialism on human rights. So while the universal international human rights system relies on an appeal to universal values, there of course have been many challenges to this claim by examining, for example, its privileging of specific perspectives in the construction of universality. And what I find intriguing about the UNESCO exhibition is that it offers a visual expression of the construction of a shared world culture, but it also very clearly illustrates its blind spots. Today, of course, although the rhetoric of universality remains strong, the official imagery of human rights tends often to be more nuanced than the UNESCO exhibition. But from this exhibition, we can see how a history of human rights was manufactured at a particular point in time by obscuring the specificity of the catalogue of rights contained in the Universal Declaration. Over to you, Emily.
Great, thank you very much, Professor Charlesworth, for that really fascinating and interesting talk. And I have so many kind of things that I want to ask you, but I want to privilege first also, of course, our audience. So we have a question that has come in, which I think kind of draws on quite nicely on how you ended the talk, actually. So I may pronounce the name slightly wrong, and I apologize in advance. It's from Lucas Lazinski, and is asking, was this drive to showcase a universal narrative and ignore kind of the decolonization? Was this just tone deaf? So were they kind of just tone deaf and ignoring this, or were they more trying in the exhibition to pander to member states when the organization was still in its infancy? What's your kind of opinion on that from looking through the different resources?
Yeah, well, Lucas, I think, is here in Australia. He's a colleague at the University of New South Wales, so he's up late, well, not so late, but up in the evening. Thanks, Lucas, for the question. I think there's now, we're getting more and more of UNESCO's archives and records becoming available, and we can find out more about what was on the minds of the people who put together the UNESCO exhibition. But I think there was this, driven by Huxley's enormous commitment to this one world idea, that was, I think, really very tone deaf to things that were going on around it. So UNESCO really, and Lucas is, I'm sure Lucas probably knows a lot more about this than me, because he's a very significant scholar of UNESCO and cultural heritage generally. But my sense from what I've read is that the enthusiasm, this one world idea, was sort of drove this exhibition. It also, in a way, the organizing committee, we do have some of their records and letters and correspondence and biographies, and they did seem very driven by the idea that it was their task to deliver this, to curate and embroider and deliver this message. And there was perhaps a determined preparedness not to look beyond the bounds of Europe to see what was going on elsewhere. They did, interestingly, one of the images, Gandhi was actually, of course, engaged in a major anti-colonial struggle at the time, was asked to contribute, and the one part of the exhibition right towards the end contains a very equivocal statement by Gandhi about the value of human rights. But that's the only reference, I think, in the whole exhibition to something that questions the value of this particular discourse for the colonial world and the anti-colonial struggle.
Great, thank you, Hilary. That's really interesting. And we've got more and more questions coming in. So I have another one, kind of more specifically on this particular UNESCO exhibition from an anonymous attendee, who is asking if there is any indication on whether the UNESCO team at the time sought to consult states or other stakeholders on the images to be included. I know you touched on this a little bit in relation to Pakistan's response, etc., but maybe if you could say a little bit more, if you know a little bit more about that background history, please.
I should say that a lot of my information, I just want to give credit to at Columbia in the United States, the New York University, about I think 5 years ago, recreated the UNESCO exhibition. I didn't see it myself. I wish I had, but and that exhibition generated some very useful information, and they've got online, if you look up Columbia University, UNESCO Human Rights Exhibition, you will see some of the interesting images that they have on their website. Well, there was an attempt. So UNESCO did write, there was a formal letter sent by the second Director General of UNESCO, Torres Bodet, who was a former Mexican diplomat, writing to all member states saying, send us your images. And so I don't know whether you call that genuine consultation, but what's very striking is that that exercise looked rather a tokenistic one, because in fact what we do know was that the exhibition images, very, very few of them, just really a handful of them, did come from that call out to states. And there are plenty of images were sent in, but the publications team at UNESCO clearly didn't quite find the images that they wanted, or else one would assume for diplomatic reasons they would have used them. And the largest part of the images seems to have come from press agencies. So they simply went through files of stock images that were there, and they were really the most popular and images by far. So there was the complaint by Pakistan, and you saw that that rather desultory, you might say, recognition of other cultures in that sort of sampling of different alphabets from around the world. But it was very narrowly drawn, and you wonder, well, what about this organising committee? Weren't they keeping an eye on the media that was actually being used? But there was a lot of tone deafness, I think, in the images. But it's possible that the actual selection wasn't guided by a very enlightened policy.
Great, thank you, Hilary. Really, really fascinating. So we've got more questions coming in, and I kind of want to use one of them to slightly sneak my own question in as my chair's privilege, because I keep thinking about this. So, this one comes in from Sarah Kim. So is asking, it says it reminds of the book of Letters to the Contrary, and asks you to speak a bit more about your understanding of universality in human rights. And I guess this is kind of where I wanted to go with this as well. I think one of the really interesting things about your presentation is that this is really kind of the origins of international human rights at that time. I mean, origins being a problematic word, as you also showed, but really kind of, I think the contemporary discourse around human rights is often, well, you know, there have been problems, but we've moved away from this, and it always was from multiple different cultures. So we're just kind of moving towards that further. And I was just wondering how looking at this exhibition made you, how you kind of think that impacts on the contemporary moment, and in what ways you can see things that relate and maybe don't as well. Yeah.
Well, thanks for the reference to the book Letters to the Contrary, which is a fantastic collection of, it's very, very relevant stuff to this exhibition. So a lot of the Marcus has collected some absolutely fascinating documents from the UNESCO archives and published them with this fantastic title, Letters to the Contrary, about some of the debates swirling around the drafting the Universal Declaration, and particularly UNESCO's role in it. So there's also a lot of focus in that book on the survey that I referred to very briefly, Unesco's Survey on Human Rights, which is sometimes still trotted out as a serious source for universal, human rights must be universal, because this bunch of mainly Western, all male philosophers told us that they really were. But I think looking at this exhibition, it now, of course, makes me look at any UN or international organization image of human rights and to think about what are we actually seeing here. And it's very, very striking. For example, if one looks at the images that the UN and NATO use to illustrate the Women, Peace and Security agenda, the agenda that was celebrated its 20th anniversary last year, it's really striking how this talk of universality is actually just a very thin carapace over an incredibly Western perspective. I did this study last year of the covers of a number of countries' national action plans that they've adopted to pursue the Women, Peace and Security agenda, particularly those from my own country, from Australia. And they always, the women who are in need of women, peace and security, they're presented as somehow shrouded, faces covered, and they're Australian women soldiers who are presented as the modern, here are the modern women, you know, you too could be wearing camouflage and wraparound sunglasses and carrying huge amounts of arms, these sort of images of the people in need of protection and the protected. So it's extremely striking. So I think that that's why I think looking at visual imagery is so valuable, because sometimes in international organizations, the language always pays correct deference to difference. But it's when you see it in visual form that you see how thin that nod to diversity really is.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Hilary. I want to kind of jump in here actually with a question from Diane Otto, which kind of is the flip side of that. So, you know, she says, I'm afraid that I think the narrative of European superiority developed by UNESCO reflected how the international community, which was Western dominated, really thought about human rights. And while the images today are perhaps more nuanced, she's wondering, kind of on the flip side, you've kind of noticed the similarities, but can you give some more concrete examples of maybe how this has changed, how things have got better and changed since then?
Oh, Di, thank you for that question that makes me look more positive. I mean, I must say, Di, I think obviously there are images that I guess speak in a very stark and important way to human rights issues. And one can think of, well, I know you've seen it because I think we perhaps have discussed it, but for example, in the National Gallery here in Victoria a couple of years ago, perhaps the last triennial, Ai Weiwei had an extraordinary image, sort of a sculpture of a refugee boat that was sort of so moving. I mean, these images that sort of emerge from that. So there's certainly been, there's certainly images that are extraordinarily powerful, but we don't find those. I'm trying to think of any exceptions in the official, in the institutional repertoire, and looking at, as I say, particularly the images that the United Nations use, we notice, and this point is made by, it's been made by many scholars, how, you know, women and children are the quintessential victims of human rights abuses, and that straight away has a different resonance than if you show a bunch of men. That just has an immediate different resonance. And the limitations of the visual depictions. So I think there have been some extraordinary works of art that capture things, but it's well, I'd love to hear if anybody out there has a suggestion of what I'll call official institutional imagery that captures some of the complexity of human rights violations. There's also, you know, there are big questions about voyeurism and the way that, you know, the consumption of images of human rights abuses too. So these are the sort of major issues in considering this question.
Definitely, thank you very much. I think, yeah, and I think thinking about institutional images versus maybe kind of more counter spaces is also quite an interesting way to think about the role of images. And I think, yeah, art exhibits more generally tend to be a bit more counter than maybe the UN images that are used. So yeah, I kind of also want to keep on that positive note a little bit, because it's nice to think about you know, different futures and ways of imagining the world. And we have a question from Ronita Mata, who is a PhD student at Essex, and she is asking, how would you, if you could, reimagine the UNESCO human rights exhibit in light of this critique of the presumption of universality that underlines human rights discourse? Like, how would you reimagine it yourself? Which I think is a very interesting question. So
it's always a challenge. Well, I suppose the glaring, well, at least one glaring absence in the UNESCO exhibition, given what was going on in many countries around the world, is the situation of people who were under the colonial yoke. And, you know, the Indian independence movement was in full swing, but we see absolutely no images at all from that. So I think if you know, with the benefit of hindsight, sort of going back to that time, to have got a broader set of images about what human rights questions there were, this fact of you know, the ahistorical way that any images from non-Western countries were dealt with, as I've said, simply not given dates, and the implication being, you know, this is happening right now, folks. Whereas, yes, we acknowledge that there were human rights abuses in Europe, but that was ages ago, and we've really moved on. So I think being a much clearer context of the images, or doing, as I mentioned just briefly at the end, the comparison with the Edward Steichen exhibition, where he expected the context really to emerge from the juxtaposition of images in this very effective way, following Ariella Azoulay's line. But I think that the also thinking through, I mean, I've referred briefly to some of the captions that were used, but there's an image, and I should have included it. The very final image in the whole exhibition was one of clearly a European, a young girl with plaits. She's very blonde. She looks as though she could be sort of Heidi-like figure. She's on a hillside, and she's a bucolic sort of nature surrounds her. And the idea seems to be, although this has actually no caption, the final image, well, this is human rights attained. We've gone through all these cycles, and the ultimate thing is to be blonde, blue-eyed on a mountainside in the fresh air. That's delivering human rights. So I think these very things that seem very much informed by advertising and products sort of what one needed to be happy, I think, were extremely limited. So maybe it was not having, perhaps having more artists involved in putting together the exhibition rather than in-house staff who were otherwise used to doing standard publicity for UNESCO. Perhaps that might have changed things too.
Definitely. And I think, like you said, the kind of focusing on what's actually happening in Europe has been such a kind of useful feminist method as well, as obviously you know very well. So I think kind of thinking about how that relates to the contemporary too is quite interesting. I think we have time probably for one last question, and it is really hard to choose from them all because there are really many great ones. I'm going to have to copy and paste the whole discussion for you, Hilary, because there's some interesting kind of facts in there too. But the kind of one that I want to end on is a little bit of a different turn. It comes in from Aoife O'Donoghue, and it's asking about the relationship between what was going on here and elsewhere in international law, such as the new international economic order. So she's wondering whether the kind of other visuals are part of this discussion, and thinking of textbook covers and the symbols that represent the various organizations, or even that are in the UN, whether there's a kind of parallel visual world between what you're discussing in this new international economic order, or if you found anything, I guess.
Well, look, thank you for the question. Yes, I think there are, and I guess that's what I'm trying to do in the larger project, is to show how, well, it's sometimes one could do a study, for example, simply of the logos of international organizations or international legal organizations, because they are really very, very rich. What's being emphasized and what's being left out, what message are they trying to give, and so on. And one could also do studies of the art that's actually used inside international institutions. And of course, there's been some fantastic work done by international lawyers on a number of these issues. And this wonderful book, sorry, if that's clear, International Law's Objects, which is on I read constantly, which is such a wonderful collection edited by Jessie Homan and Daniel Joyce. This has some fantastic chapters that deal with, for example, the images on the windows of the courtroom, the main courtroom in the ICJ. There are so many fantastic chapters in this book that really emphasize the way that objects and visuality sort of reflect, sometimes problematize, but mainly reflect standard views of international law. I'm not specifically on the new international economic order. It's a great question. I haven't thought about the way that was that has been reflected in artistic medium, and of course it had a brief life, and in a sense the general failure of that initiative to make much impact in the 1970s is perhaps one reason why, although there may well be people who can think of examples of the way that it's represented, but it's striking how I guess the point, really, the most basic point of the paper is that once we move away from the texts of international law, the words of international law, to look at their imagery, we can see this very rich, powerful story that we very rarely stop to unpack, and that it's worth taking the time to do so.
Definitely. Well, thank you very much, Professor Charlesworth. I think we should probably end it because I know it's pretty late where you are as well, and I don't want to keep you up too late. But that was a really fascinating talk, and it's really got me thinking a lot about kind of methodology and images. And yeah, I love the International Laws Objects book as well. So that's a really great tip. So, and thank you everybody for your questions. I really didn't get through even half of them, which we never do. You always have such great questions, but I have copied them over because I know there's some useful information for Hilary, as I said, that there. So I'll send that to Professor Charlesworth as well. So I guess that's the end for this week. Just a quick reminder that next week we will have Campbell McLaughlin QC, who will be talking about systemic integration revisited. So that should be another very good one. So do tune in for that one. But otherwise, I would like to thank Professor Hilary Charlesworth for joining us. It was really a pleasure to host you, and really meant a lot personally to me as well. So thank you, Hilary.
Thanks so much, Emily, and thanks for the fantastic questions. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye, everyone. Thank you.